Fog doesn't show up on radar the way you'd think. It doesn't block the signal or scatter the return the way rain does. It just sits there, invisible to the machines, while it swallows everything a human eye would need to actually see what's happening on the ground. I've spent 40 years learning to read what the fog was hiding, because the radar scope in front of me was never the whole truth. It was a story the machines were telling themselves, and my job, most nights, was knowing where that story stopped matching the runway. My name is Hal Ridgeway. Everyone at Colfax Regional called me Hal, except the FAA paperwork, which still listed me as Senior Terminal Radar Approach Control Specialist, 39 years of active certification, not one operational incident on my record in all that time. That record mattered to me more than most things in my life, including, if I'm honest, a couple of marriages. I trained half the controllers working towers across 3 states. One of them was Mara Voss. Mara came through Colfax as a 19-year-old trainee in a federal apprenticeship program, sharp enough to make senior controllers nervous within her first month, humble enough that none of us minded. I spent 2 years teaching her the parts of the job that never show up in a training manual: how to hear a pilot's voice go tight with fatigue 3 words into a readback, how to feel a wind shift coming before the anemometer confirmed it, how to trust the quiet, persistent unease in your gut when a scope full of green blips didn't quite match the sound of the airfield around you. She left Colfax at 26 to work systems design, and I was proud of her, genuinely, the way you're proud of a kid who outgrows the room you taught them in. By the time she came back into my life 17 years later, she wasn't wearing a headset anymore. She was wearing a company badge that said Sky Lattice Systems, Director of Terminal Automation, and she'd been hired to install something called ClearPath at Colfax Regional, an AI-driven conflict resolution advisory system that processed transponder data, ground radar returns, and weather telemetry to recommend real-time sequencing and separation calls to tower controllers, cutting the workload that currently required 4 certified controllers down to a projected 2. "It's not replacing you, Hal," she told me, the first week she was back, standing in the tower cab with a tablet under her arm the way she used to carry a training binder. "It's an advisory layer. You still make every call. ClearPath just gives you better information faster than you can build it yourself. I've been building it myself for 39 years. I'm not sure faster is the part I'm missing." She smiled at that, the particular smile she'd had since she was 19, the one that meant she respected the objection and was going to ignore it anyway. I didn't hold that against her. It's the same smile I used to give my own trainers, 40 years back, when I was sure the new radar handoff procedure was going to be the thing that finally got somebody killed, and it wasn't, and eventually I stopped being sure of very much at all except what my own eyes and ears told me in the moment. Mara wasn't wrong that Colfax needed help. The airport had grown faster than its staffing, 3 new regional carriers added in 2 years, and the current controller roster was running mandatory overtime that the union had been flagging as a fatigue risk for 18 months running. ClearPath, on paper, solved a real problem. It processed radar and transponder data across the full terminal area faster than any human brain could, cross-referencing aircraft separation, ground vehicle positions, and runway status in a continuously updating model that flagged conflicts before a human controller would consciously register them. What it couldn't do, what no system built on transponder data and radar returns could do, was see the things that didn't carry a transponder at all. The first sign of trouble came during Colfax's fog season, which arrives every November like clockwork and turns the airfield into a place where visibility can drop from 3 miles to 400 feet in the time it takes to finish a coffee. Ground vehicles at Colfax, snowplows, de-icing trucks, the maintenance crews who service runway lighting, operated on a mix of equipment, some newer trucks with modern ADS-B transponders that broadcast position automatically, and a handful of older vehicles, budget holdovers from a decade-old fleet upgrade that had run out of funding halfway through. Those older trucks relied on the ground crew calling in position reports over radio, the way ground operations had worked for 60 years before satellite tracking existed. ClearPath's ground conflict model was built entirely on transponder returns. It had no way to account for a vehicle that wasn't broadcasting one, because as far as the system's underlying map was concerned, a vehicle without a transponder simply didn't exist on the airfield at all, a blind spot invisible not because the system was flawed in its design, but because the airport's own equipment fleet was incomplete. A fact buried 3 budget cycles deep in a maintenance procurement report nobody at Skylattice had been shown before implementation. I flagged it in October, in writing, in the formal safety concern process the union had fought 15 years to get written into federal contracts. I documented, specifically, that 4 of Colfax's 11 ground vehicles lacked functioning transponders, and that ClearPath's ground conflict advisory, as currently configured, could not detect those vehicles' positions during low-visibility operations. Mara's response came back through her operations director, a capable, overworked man named Desai who I liked well enough and who had absolutely no authority to change anything about Skylattice rollout timeline. The response cited a procurement order already in motion to replace the older ground vehicles with transponder-equipped models, completion projected for the following spring, 5 months after fog season would already be over. "We know about the gap, Hal," Mara told me directly, when I pushed the issue past Desai and got 15 minutes of her actual time. "It's documented, it's being fixed, and in the meantime, ground crews are required to maintain radio contact with tower on every movement during low-vis conditions. That's the mitigation. It's not perfect, but it's the same mitigation the airports used for years before ClearPath ever existed. The mitigation worked for years because tower controllers were listening for it as their primary information, Mara. Not as a backup check on a system that's telling them the airfield's already clear. You're still the primary authority in that tower. ClearPath is advisory. If you hear a radio call that contradicts the display, you act on what you hear." She was right, in the way that a true statement can still describe a system quietly training people to trust the wrong thing. I'd watched, over 6 weeks of ClearPath operating in the tower, controllers half my age start reflexively glancing at the display first, the radio second, not because anyone told them to, but because the display was fast, and confident, and rarely wrong, and it is a very human thing to gradually trust the tool that's right 99 times out of 100, right up until the 100th time arrives without warning. I raised it again in a staff meeting in early November, in front of the full shift roster, because I'd started noticing something that worried me more than the transponder gap itself. New hires, controllers with 18 months or less on the boards, had started treating ClearPath's ground conflict display as the primary picture of the airfield, full stop, the same way a younger generation trusts a GPS over their own sense of direction even when the road in front of them clearly doesn't match the map. It wasn't laziness. It was exactly what you'd expect from good training on an incomplete tool. They were trusting the system precisely because it had been right, consistently, for months. "I watched Delgado key up a clearance last week without a radio scan first," I told the room. "Just glanced at the display, saw it clear, made the call. Nothing went wrong that day." But nothing going wrong isn't the same thing as nothing being at risk. Desai, Mara's operations director, made a note of it. I don't think anyone in that room disagreed with me, exactly. What I heard back, from more than one younger controller, was some version of the same sentiment. The display processes 40 data points a second, faster than any of us can build the picture manually, and it's been right every single time so far. It's hard to argue a system out of someone's trust using a hypothetical, when the system has spent 6 straight weeks being correct. I understood the logic. I'd have believed it myself, probably, at 29. What 40 years teaches you that 29 years doesn't, though, is that a system's track record only tells you how good it's been at the things it was designed to notice. It tells you nothing at all about the things it was never built to see in the first place, and by December, with the fog rolling in every morning and Colfax's replacement ground vehicles still 5 months out on the procurement calendar, I'd started coming in 20 minutes before every shift, just to walk the ready room and remind the newer controllers, one more time, that a radio call from the ground still outranked a clean-looking screen. Some of them listened because they respected me. Some of them listened because they were tired of hearing it and it was easier to nod. I didn't much care which, as long as it stuck. The morning it almost happened was the second week of December, visibility down to 500 feet in freezing fog, the kind of Colfax morning that turns the whole airfield into a world you navigate by sound and instrument rather than sight. I remember the specific quality of that fog because I'd flagged it, half joking, to Reyes when we walked into the tower cab at 5:40 that morning, dense enough that the runway threshold lights were just a soft smear of white from the cab windows, the kind of morning where you could hear a truck's engine on the far taxiway before you'd ever have a hope of seeing it. I was working the tower cab alongside Reyes, 29 years old, sharp, well-trained, exactly the kind of controller Colfax needed more of, and exactly the kind of controller I worried about most, because his instincts were good and his trust in the display was, by December, almost total. He'd been running 6 consecutive weeks of clean shifts with ClearPath at his shoulder, and I'd watched him get faster and more confident with every one of them, the way any skilled young controller does with a tool that keeps proving itself useful. ClearPath's ground conflict display showed runway 27 clear for a regional jet's takeoff roll, Flight 4471, a 50-passenger commuter aircraft already lined up and cleared, engines spooling for departure, the pilot's readback crisp and routine over the frequency. Reyes had his eyes on the display, one hand resting near his own transmit key, the picture in front of him about as clean and simple as an airfield ever looks on a fog morning. What ClearPath's display did not show, because it had no transponder data to show it with, was Ground Vehicle 6, one of the 4 older trucks from my October report, currently crossing runway 27 at the midfield intersection, its de-icing crew responding to an unscheduled request from a taxiing regional aircraft that had radioed for emergency wing de-icing after an ice buildup was spotted by its own flight crew 10 minutes earlier. It was exactly the kind of unscheduled, reactive ground movement that never shows up on a pre-planned sequencing model, because nobody plans for ice forming faster than forecast on a wing at 5 in the morning. Ortiz's crew had scrambled fast, the way ground crews at Colfax always had, moving on instinct and radio coordination the way they'd done it for 30 years before anyone had heard of ClearPath. The ground crew supervisor, Ortiz, radioed his position the way he always had, the way every ground crew at Colfax had for decades, Tower, Ground 6, crossing runway 27 at midfield, request acknowledgement. I heard it clearly, the way I'd trained myself to hear every transmission on that frequency as a distinct thread, separate from whatever the display was telling me, running in a parallel channel in my head the same way a parent can pick a single child's voice out of a crowded playground. Reyes, 6 feet away, focused on the ClearPath display that showed the runway clear and a departure sequence already counting down toward a clean, on-schedule release, did not. This is the part of the story I've turned over more times than any other moment in my 40 years in that tower, because it happened in under 4 seconds, and every one of those seconds mattered. Hold 4471, I said, already keying my own radio before Reyes had fully processed what I'd said to him, my voice pitched low and flat and absolutely certain, the tone I'd spent decades training into my own reflexes for exactly this kind of moment. Hold your takeoff roll. Traffic on the runway. The regional jet's pilot, already at full power, aborted the takeoff roll at 80 knots, a hard, controlled stop that shuddered through the aircraft and rattled every coffee cup in the tower cab, but held, exactly the way a trained pilot executes an aborted takeoff when a controller's voice cuts through with that particular tone that leaves no room for a clarifying question first. I found out later, from the captain's own account in the incident interview, that he hadn't seen anything on his own instruments to suggest a problem. He'd simply trusted the voice on the radio, the way pilots are trained to, the way the entire system is built to function when it's working the way it's supposed to. Ground Vehicle 6 cleared the runway 11 seconds later, Ortiz's voice slightly breathless over the radio, entirely unaware, in that moment, of how close the math had actually come. Reyes sat frozen for a second afterward, staring at a display that still, even as the truck cleared the far side of the runway, showed nothing on runway 27 at all, a clean, confident, entirely wrong picture of an airfield that had come within seconds of a catastrophe the system had no way of ever knowing about. It didn't show anything, he said, quietly, more to himself than to me. The whole time. It didn't show anything. It's not built to show what it can't measure, son. That's not a flaw in the math. That's just the edge of what the math was ever asked to do. I calculated it afterward, the way I calculate everything, on paper, by hand. At the aircraft's rate of acceleration and ground vehicle SX's crossing speed in the fog, a takeoff roll continued for even 6 more seconds would have placed a 50-passenger regional jet and a stationary de-icing truck at the same point on runway 27 within a margin of roughly 200 feet. ClearPath's display, throughout the entire event, had continued showing the runway as clear. Mara flew out to Colfax 3 days later, and I want to be honest about how that conversation actually went, because it wasn't the confrontation I might have written for it if I were telling a simpler story. She sat across from me in the break room, still in her Sky Lattice badge, and she didn't try to defend the display, or cite a confidence interval, or tell me the system had performed within its documented parameters. She'd already pulled the incident logs herself before she landed. "You saved that airplane because you were listening to a channel my system doesn't read," she said. "I need you to know I understand that. I'm not here to argue about it." "I know you're not, Mara. That's not really why I asked to talk to you." What I actually wanted to say to her, and eventually did, was harder than an argument about transponders. I told her that I understood exactly why she believed in what she was building, because I remembered training her, at 19, on nights when the old manual sequencing procedures had genuinely put aircraft in dangerous proximity through simple human fatigue and overload, the same kind of fatigue that had been building across Colfax's controller roster for 18 months before ClearPath ever arrived. She wasn't wrong that the old way had real, documented failure modes of its own. I'd watched some of them happen, decades earlier, and I'd carried those nights the same way I now carried this one. The system isn't the enemy, Mara. I never thought it was. I think the enemy is believing any single system, human or otherwise, is complete. The old manual procedures weren't complete. ClearPath isn't complete. The only thing that's ever actually been complete, in 40 years of watching this airfield, is a controller who's required, by policy and not just by instinct, to treat every input as partial information. She didn't argue with that. She sat with it for a long moment, the way I remembered her sitting with hard feedback as a trainee, actually turning it over instead of deflecting it. There was no boardroom confrontation. No federal inquiry with press coverage, no dramatic reversal of a corporate contract, no twisted piece of steel placed on a glass table to make a point. The incident report was filed, reviewed internally by the FAA's Regional Safety Office, and closed within 6 weeks with a set of recommended procedural changes that Mara personally championed inside Sky Lattice, quietly and without fanfare, the way real fixes to real systems usually happen. ClearPath's ground conflict model was rebuilt within 4 months to incorporate mandatory radio position reports as a primary data input, not merely a backup check, meaning any vehicle without an active transponder now triggered an explicit, unmissable, unverified position flag on the display itself, rather than simply omitting the vehicle from the picture entirely. It was a small change, technically. It was the difference, in practice, between a system that lied by omission and one that told controllers, honestly, when it didn't know something. Colfax's remaining transponder-less ground vehicles were replaced within 8 weeks, not the following spring, a procurement timeline Mara moved up herself, using budget authority I suspect she had to fight for internally in ways she never described to me in detail. I didn't get a formal commendation. There was no press release, no local news segment about the old controller who'd stopped a disaster. Ortiz bought me a coffee the next week and didn't say much beyond, "Appreciate you, Hal," which, between two people who've spent decades in this business, said everything that needed saying. I'm 68 now, still working the Colfax Tower 2 shifts a week, mostly training, mostly making sure the newest generation of controllers learn to listen to the radio channel first and the display second, the way I taught Mara to do it 20 years before either of us had ever heard of ClearPath. Mara calls sometimes, not often, usually when Sky Lattice is rolling out a new feature and she wants a controller's honest read on it before it goes live anywhere else. I give her my honest read. She doesn't always like it. She implements it anyway, more often than not, which is its own kind of answer to a question neither of us has ever needed to say out loud. The fog still comes to Colfax every November, the same as it has for the 60 years this airfield has existed, swallowing the runway lights down to a soft orange glow you learn to trust more than you trust your own eyes. ClearPath still runs in that tower cab, faster and more capable now than it was the winter ground vehicle 6 crossed a runway the system couldn't see. I still listen to the radio first. Some nights, watching a new trainee's eyes flick between the display and the window the way Reyes's did that December morning, I think about how easy it would have been for that flight, and everyone on it, to become a story with a very different ending, not because anyone was careless, or arrogant, or wrong about what they believed, but because a system built entirely on what it could measure had quietly, gradually, taught good people to stop listening for what it couldn't. The scope in front of a controller has never been the whole truth. It's a story the machines tell themselves. The job, same as it's always been, is knowing exactly where that story stops matching the runway, and having the discipline, every single time, to trust your own ears when it does.